Citizens of the world, welcome to WCEG Talk Radio. We are here to converse, to educate, and maybe along the way, even save lives. We are the worldwide community empowerment group, where we speak life into the community. Today is Friday, June 16th, 2023. You are viewing and listening to a special edition of Issues and Answers, and I am your host, Norman A. Carter Jr. Our goal is to make you a little bit more informed than you were before you tuned in. Citizens of the world, this is definitely the new WCEG. Did you know that we are now beaming and streaming on Roku? We have our own TV channel now. How about that? We are flowing, growing, and reaching out to more people in more ways than ever before. Now, you may subscribe to us free on your YouTube channel by just typing in WCEG Network, then look for Issues and Answers. You can find us on YouTube. We are there. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. We are there. You may access us via your Apple Watch, iPad, iPhone, and Android phone. Just go to the appropriate store for your device and download our free app. Of course, our veteran viewers and listeners know that you can just type WCEGTalkRadio.com in your computer or iPhone browser, search for Issues and Answers, that's us, then click on the live stream tab. There is just no excuse for not finding us somewhere to locate our always informative broadcast. Now, the topics and the opinions are those of the show host and guests. But sometimes we get out there. They are not the opinions of management. Don't get it twisted. Direct your comments and questions, complaints, and accolades, little rounds of applause, right here where they belong. Let's get on into our show. This is the fourth installment of Pew Power, Denominational Church Polity and Policy. And our special guest today is Reverend Dr. Estrelda Alexander. Dr. Alexander, welcome to WCEG.
Thank you very much.
I'd like, before we get into the meat of our interview, I would like to give our audience I can't say a thumbnail sketch, but at least a sketch of your bio, because it is so extensive. And believe me, as long as this might be, I am abbreviating it. Reverend Dr. Alexander is a sociologist and political theologian. She is the founding president of the William Joseph Seymour Foundation. She received her Bachelor of Arts degree in sociology from Howard University, her MA in sociology from Columbia University, where she was a Ford Foundation Fellow. That's a big wow. Her Master of Divinity came from Wesley Theological Seminary. She was cum laude, and her PhD in political theology from the Catholic University of America. In 1998, she was called to be an Associate Dean of Community Life at Wesley Theological Seminary and served in that capacity until 2002. She left Wesley to serve on the theology faculty of Regent University of Divinity from 2003 to 2013, moving up to the rank of full professor. Now, folks, Reverend Dr. Alexander is an author with extensive writings. Extensive. It would take us much too long to get into all of them. In addition, she has authored more than 40 essays and journal articles, and has lectured on college campuses and in conferences, and preached in pulpits across the US of A. Dr. Alexander has been a member of the Pentecostal Studies since 1994 and served as president in 2009. Her awards include the Numa Book of the Year Award for Black Fire in 2013 and the Award of Excellence from Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary in that same year, and a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Society for Pentecostal Studies in 2014. As an ordained minister in the Church of God in Cleveland, Tennessee, she has served as church planter and pastor, as well as on pastoral staff, a staff member with the Church of God and other Pentecostal denominations. She has preached and lectured in pulpits, conferences, and academic settings from across the United States and the Caribbean. Her passion for research in Pentecostalism is matched by a passion to see the evangelical Christian community, and particularly the Pentecostal movement, embrace a vision of social holiness and justice embodied in the full participation, let me go back to that, full participation of women and people of color within the life of the church and society. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Those credentials are just so outstanding. Thank you for joining us, Reverend.
Thank you again for having me.
It's funny, based on recent news, don't want to put any pressure on you, but recent news that just came out within the past couple of days, and I thought about you, I just call them out. The Southern Baptist Convention just put the kibosh on women leading the church and women doing exactly what you are doing here. Wow, how do you feel about that? I can imagine what your response would be, but
I'm an ordained minister in my denomination, but my denomination, like the Southern Baptist, sidelines women. So even though I'm ordained, I have had a very rough road. And Pentecostalism, the evangelicals have a hard time with women, period. So it's not news. And but to see Rick Warren take a stand and to pull out a major leader, and more major leaders have to take stands. If we had major leaders doing what they should do, we would see more change. But, I've been fighting this battle for years. And we have made some progress, but women are still sidelined in a lot of ways. Women rarely are assigned in any denomination to the most affluent or the most prosperous or the most progressive churches. They usually are sent someplace that men don't want to go. Mm-hmm. And in my tradition, we have a tradition of sending women to plant churches, and once the church becomes viable, turn it over to a man. So this is the news to me.
Well, I go back to not just Jesus. With we know there were many women who supported his ministry and were absolutely putting out the gospel at that time. But when we go to Paul and talk about Aquila and so many other people, yes, and exactly. Yeah, funny thing about Junia is that for years that name was misinterpreted as being a male. But we're getting really deep in the woods here. But I think it's important to know that on the basis of our religion and faith, that women, if you look at the Bible and you look at biblical history, you find that women were always at the center of our religion, and they were not just marginal players, as some emasculated men tried to make them. But anyway,
even in the life of the church, women have been the mainstay of the church. If the women stayed home, there'd be no church.
Correct.
So correct. You can try to sideline all you want, but there'd be no church without women. So
that's right. Bottom line, let your voice continue to be heard, Reverend Doctor. Please. Well, and this actually flows into our topic today about church polity, church leadership. What does that look like in our churches, even in the Pentecostal movement? How does it look? So we talk about succession planning, and part of planting churches is establishing leaders.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you've had a lot of experience with that, at least according to your resume. One of the things that I had questions that I had here, or is that Baptist polity rests on these basic beliefs, and polities include a regenerate church membership, which we're lacking in that today, congregational church governance under the leadership, under the lordship of Christ, or the autonomy of churches, and voluntary cooperation. That's, in my opinion, that is not only building followers, but that's also building leaders, if I am correct. I'd like for you to expound on that if you could.
Well,
from your perspective.
Right now, it's really funny because I've been part of other denominations. Right now, I actually attend a Methodist church, and so I don't know a lot about Baptist polity, but I do know that it's very different from Pentecostal in that there's more congregational. We're congregational participation, more congregational leadership. It's not top down, so people are they're prepared, they're developed to become leaders, and that's an important part of building disciples, building people to become leaders, to take ownership of the church, and that's a good thing. We don't always see that within our own tradition. Our tradition is more top down generally. I was telling your producer that there, when people talk about Pentecostalism, there is no Pentecostal denomination. Pentecostalism is a movement with more than 200 denominations, even in the United States.
Wow.
And most of the time, when people hear that I'm Pentecostal and they see me and I'm Black, they assume I belong to the Church of God in Christ, which is the largest Pentecostal, the largest African American or Black Pentecostal denomination in the world with 6 million people, but there are 200 Pentecostal denominations. Each of them is different, but most of them are led top down. And so you fall in line with the leadership, let's put it that way. And that comes about in different ways, but mostly the leadership is Episcopal, so the bishop, or they don't always call them bishops, but there's someone at the top, almost like a pope, who let's say who supposedly hears from God and then hands down that information to the rest of the body who kind of carries that out. So, but it differs from denomination. Some of them are more congregational, but the final say is what the pastor determines. God said.
Well, and I'm glad that you brought up congregational leadership, because we can go back, and I'm going to go back and refer to the New Testament, where there is evidence of decisions being put back to the, I go back to the disciple Stephen, and how although the congregation was asked to select people from among them who fit a certain criteria, it wasn't the preacher or the leader, so-called leader. They went to the people, and the people selected them. And I think what happens, and I don't mean to be running off here, but the so-called, we'll say, leader, do you think there should be more of a guide than a demagogue, so to speak?
Well, in the Pentecostal movement, I grew up Pentecostal, so I've been Pentecostal a long time, and we have this biblical command. The Bible says, "Reverence no man." So Pentecostals don't call their pastors reverend. So
Okay.
you might be pastor so-and-so or elder so-and-so. But even though we don't, and so we get very offended, and people get offended if you call them reverend. But
My
there's so much
goodness.
reverence of these people. So I think it's very interesting that we don't use the term, but we give so much reverence to a man that that all this power is in the hands of a, and usually it is a man. Now I will tell you, since we talked about women, of the 200 denominations that I can think of, about 15 of them were actually started by, at least 15 viable denominations were actually started by women. But usually it is a man or a group of men who come together and lead in the beginning of something. But there's a lot of power, and part of it, I teach a course on African spirituality, Black spirituality, and I talk about uh, uh, ancestor veneration. And it's really funny because we sometimes denounce the very things that we do because within Pentecostalism that's a no-no, or we don't venerate ancestors, but we really do. And if you go into these churches, you'll see that these pastors are held in such high esteem, they're venerated. And so that's part of Pentecostal culture, that we name our churches after our pastors. And we've gotten this new phenomenon, is that when the head pastor dies, somehow we get the city to name the street after them. So we're venerating these people as if they were saints. We're making saints out of them. And so it's very interesting. The culture is very interesting.
But I think that's when we go from being caught up in scripture and go and are going and get caught up in tradition,
And
those
yes,
man-made
yes,
traditions, which often lead us to problems.
yeah.
And this is a great example, because when you venerate a leader, I'll use that word, and there isn't the proper instruction or teaching or empowerment of the congregation, that leaves a void when the human factor comes in that we all have to deal with: illness and death.
Yes.
Then we have chaos. And we have examples of that now with this, where people want to insert themselves and grab onto that power. The egos get in the way, and this is what I want. This is what my little group wants, much to the disbenefit
Well,
of the congregation.
we have another interesting phenomenon within Pentecostalism. And I think this might exist in other churches, but nepotism is a very strong point. And so when we talk about succession, often churches are handed down through families. So you'll see Bishop so-and-so, and there's no question, when Bishop so-and-so dies, his son will become the bishop, or his son will become the lead pastor. That rarely happens if the person is a daughter. If there is no son, then that's interesting. But you don't see, I know within the Baptist tradition, you have pastors who have sons, young men they're training and grooming for leadership, but they could be anybody in the congregation. But usually within the Pentecostal tradition, and I can name some very big churches where that's the deal, that the bishop, and often the bishop is the founder and goes from having a single church to sometimes multiple churches and a large denomination. But the leadership goes down, and so there's no question that will happen. And often, and there's been very good leaders who have been very dynamic, and they were gifted, but their sons weren't. And so when they turned the denomination over to the son, the denomination is watered down. I know one, and I won't call a name, but there was a bishop who was very involved in social justice and did some major things for his city. And he turned the church over to his son, and his son basically is just treading water. And built because it's a large church, it's very lucrative. So he's been able to do some things, but mostly for himself, not for the community.
And I'm going back to congregational leadership again, congregational empowerment, and this is what happens when you disempower the congregation. And I liked when the way you speak of people not becoming, we're not so quick to attach titles to certain people, because that puts everyone on almost an equal plane, almost. Someone has to be the orchestrator, so to speak.
Yeah.
But it's just like a conductor of an orchestra. Music is there, but it's nothing if you take away different portions of the orchestra.
To play.
Correct. And everyone is a value, even the little piccolo player, valued. And we there seems to be a trend to move away from that. And I'm really impressed by, number one, you're informing our viewing and listening audience that there are 200 denominations of Pentecostalism. 200.
The major denominations, the Assemblies of God, people don't, because they don't put the term Pentecostal in their name, but the Assemblies of God is probably the largest, and followed by the Church of God in Christ. My denomination is several million people. One of the major denominations was started by a woman, the Church of the Four Square, which is Pentecostal, started by Amy Sybil McPherson in the 1920s. It's 1 million strong. So we got, and then we have denominations that may be 5 churches, but they call themselves a denomination. And I know one that's 2 churches, but they call themselves a denomination. But we have one of the churches, Mount Sinai Holy Church, was started by a woman who is my role model, really, Ada Robinson. And for 70 years, that denomination was led by a woman, and she didn't have children. But what she did was she groomed women to take her place. So when she died, for 70 years, they had women bishops at the head of that church. And finally, the men threw a coup, and now it's in male leadership. And there's very little leadership of women at the very top of that denomination. But for 70 years, she was able to pull that off. So, it's interesting. And every denomination within Pentecostalism has its own polity. So there is no set, we all do it this way. No, we don't.
Okay.
We have certain things that make us Pentecostal, like the belief in the baptism of the Holy Spirit. That's universal within Pentecostalism. We don't do sacraments. We do ordinances. That's universal within Pentecostalism. So you don't have the sacrament of baptism. You have the ordinance of baptism. Although I believe that baptism is sacramental, but that's my personal belief. And that's the other thing that often, and I think within Baptists and other denominations, there's more openness to people saying, I buy the basic tenets, but these are my personal beliefs. But almost in some ways, you have to buy the whole kit and caboodle to be considered Pentecostal. And that's problematic for people like me who have, I think sometimes beyond that. So that becomes, but you're not free to, so have the discussion. You're not free to discuss something unless you're speaking the party line. And that's a problem.
Absolutely. And I think where we have to value you, because you are documented as having international experience, and that means you have moved among different cultures, different groups of people, and you've heard views of people from different congregations, and those help to form who you are at this moment. And a lot of your a lot of your beliefs, which many of us do not have.
Well,
And I,
comfortable. We don't feel comfortable talking about religion unless we're speaking the party line. But for
right,
me, part of the freedom of being a Christian, I mean, follower of Christ, love Jesus with all your heart. But and most of us don't have convictions. We don't have personal convictions. We have opinions, and they change. But I think every Christian has to develop a set of convictions, things that I believe are true. And I believe they're true because this is what the Bible says. And we interpret the Bible different. Like you said, we talk about Junia. Well, we know that she was a woman, but people read that different ways. But, go back and really study. And a lot of people don't. But if they're told that she was a man, they believe she was a man, they never bother to go look up and see who she really was. And so often like you were talking about going from from milk to bread, a lot of us are still on the milk. We know that we can quote the Bible scriptures, but we don't know what they mean. So it's interesting. I was on a Bible study a couple of weeks ago with a young man, and he was, and this is often what happens. The other thing with Pentecostals, for many years, they were anti-theological education. So the belief was that you read the Bible, God speaks to you, and that's all you need. So it was never a sense that there might be a deeper meaning in the text than what I'm seeing on the surface. And so, and that's problematic. That's changing somewhat. I know when I first went to seminary, my church almost had a fit. And people were very upset that I was a woman, and there were no men going to seminary. And so the reaction of people was negative, but because I know that I'm a groundbreaker, since I went, several other women in the congregation went to seminary, but they were waiting for permission for someone to tell them it was okay. And when, one of the concerns was, you're going to go to seminary, you're going to lose your faith. Well, when I didn't lose my faith, they found out it was okay to go. And so they went. But I remember one of the women who finally ended up going to Bible school, she can go to seminary, and her son was called to the ministry. And I was saying to him, you ought to go to seminary, and she was vehemently against even the thought that somebody would do that. And we have this joke, they have this joke, they call a seminary the cemetery. You're going to the cemetery. And so that whole anti-theological education piece was problematic for many years. We still don't see that most of our community are not trained.
right. And I agree with you on 2 points. Number one, the seminary classes that I went to, predominantly female, and I teach Bible study at my little church. And one of the first things that I heard was that going to seminary or taking theological courses is something that should be avoided because it changes your perception of what the Bible says, and it doesn't.
Well, it can't. Well, I tell people you shouldn't go to seminary unless your faith is grounded. Too often,
yes,
why people's faith change in seminary, they never had a real faith when they got there. Somebody told them they were to be a minister and they go to seminary. But if you know God and you've had a relationship with God, seminary is not going to change that. And the other thing is, when you go to seminary, you have to be as questioning in seminary. My seminary professors would say certain things, and I say that ain't true. But most of my classmates would, oh yeah, and they would change. They hear a new thing. You can't do that. You have to know what you believe, and you have to test what you believe against what they're saying.
Exactly. It's not an indoctrination.
No.
Because there needs to be give and take in there, and allowing people to voice their opinions, because and I'll take this even for our professors, you're never so knowledgeable that you can't learn something.
Right.
and even the greatest teachers learn.
And I even tell people that it's good to go to a seminary that's not in your tradition, because that challenges you to hold on to your faith. If you can hear somebody else say something that you don't agree with, I have another young colleague. I mentored several young people, and she went to a Methodist seminary, and she was very offended because they didn't respect her Pentecostal faith. She said she was an A student, she was doing fine, but they would say stuff that she didn't like, and so she left. And I'm like, if you can't stand, you got to be able to be in conversation with people who don't agree with you. You can't run away every time you hear something that because we live in a world where the Christian faith itself is being attacked on every edge. We got to be able to answer people, and so it's important that we learn from people who disagree with us.
Yeah, and I go back to that. I hate to go back to him, but Jesus throughout the New Testament was putting himself in with people who disagreed with him totally.
Didn't like him.
Paul, same thing.
Yeah,
disagreed with him totally. But if as one of my favorite reverends reminded me yesterday, iron sharpens iron.
Yeah.
And it's true. And wow, Q power. That's what our topic is today, folks. And we are getting into it. And one of the things that we have been into the body of what we've been talking about today is congregational empowerment. And Doctor, I'm sure that had to be in your church planting. That had to be an ingredient in your planting different churches. Would I be correct in that?
Well, let me say this. I'm not a church planter by choice. I'm a church planter because in my denomination, even though in my state, I have more education than every man in my state. As a woman, I would never be offered a church. So I've had to plant churches to be a pastor. But I've always, I always love working with young people, because young people are the leaders of tomorrow, and most of them are the leaders today. And so, to not just, I'm not and the way that you build congregational power is to be a team player. I've never been the one that wanted to be the bishop. We are building this church. So what can we do to make a go of this? Unfortunately, I've never seen a church to fruition, because something else has come up, and I ended up being dean, or I ended up being a professor. And I only went to seminary. I only went to graduate school. I went to seminary because I wanted to pastor. But when I got out of seminary, I was told that as a Black woman, I would have issues in the denomination. There was no church for me, is what they said. So I did well in seminary, and my professors always said, you need a PhD. So I ended up doing a PhD, but that was never my desire. I wanted to pastor. And I have served on pastoral staffs and and I've served with good pastors who did allow that input. But usually, again, when you serve within a Pentecostal tradition, the pastor is the final word. And often, and I gotta say this, and I want to say this with a little bit of humility, but I want to be truthful. Because of the gifting that God has given me as a leader, I've often been a threat to other pastors, because I don't think within the box. I do try to come up with innovative things. Our churches sometimes are dying. You go into a dying church, okay, let me try to help you. But that's often seen as, oh, you want to be in charge? So we have to develop a different model within Pentecostalism. There's been churches, I've been in several churches, because we moved, we've been in Virginia Beach, we live different places. Often when a church is dying, it's because the pastor is stagnant, but often those pastors will not hear new things, young people, new voices, this the way. And we always get this thing, people say, the church people say this is the way we've always done it, so we don't want to change it. But it's also those are the pastors that say that we've always done it this way, so why change it now? Even though you might see the congregation dying around you, we're not going to change. And I think that we're in a generation now that, first of all, young people are not coming to church the way that we went to church. So we have to learn, first of all, to speak their language if we want to empower them, to let them come into the church. And, you know, I'm not into hip hop. I'm not into, but that's what they're into. So we can't say, well, you can't do that here. I'm in a church right now, and it's an older church, and I'm going there. My girlfriend is the pastor, and they're building from scratch. I mean, they're old. They died out, and mostly old people there, but they are all involved. I will say that. But the music that they sing, young people don't sing that stuff, and so the stuff that young people sing, I don't understand what they're saying half the time. But that's the way they express themselves. So we have to learn, how do we have church that includes everybody, and how can we take things that some traditions are sacred. We don't want to lose certain things, but we also don't want to hold on, like you said, to traditions of men that we have incorporated into our churches, that we have that it's not biblical or unbiblical, but this is the way we've always done it, but it doesn't work anymore. So how do we do that? One of the things my girlfriend, she may be listening, I don't know, but she was joking about, she was in the pulpit, and she's an excellent preacher. And she was preaching about bringing your Bible to church. And she held up her Bible and said, "This is the Bible." It was and I held up my cell phone and said, "So is this." Because young people, young people don't carry Bibles. And that doesn't mean they don't read the Bible, but we can't put them down because they use a different technology. We have to say, how can we incorporate that technology into the church? How can we make the church relevant to the age that we live in? Because, the Bible says something that I think is that we often miss. It says all things were created for his pleasure. And so all this technology, everything that's been created has been created for the glory of God. And so we can't surrender it to ungodly, secular uses. When he's made it available for us, we have to figure out how to incorporate it into what we're doing for God, for this generation.
I think that's a great statement that I hope a lot of people are listening to. If you're not reaching out to young people and bringing in young people, your church will die.
And even old people. I mean, nowadays, a lot of people can't go to church. So if we don't make the church available to them, they won't do church. And
correct.
You gotta make ways to, and God, who knows everything, knew what times were coming up. So he's already prepared for this time. He's not surprised by the time that we live.
And I once, of course, I got into trouble saying it, but I said if they had Zoom back in the time of Jesus, he would have used that instead of walking miles and miles and miles. And and there are church leaders today who disdain Zoom, who look down on it. But if that is another avenue for you to reach your congregation, then you have to use it. You can't.
You do, and touching people is wonderful, and being able to hug and give everybody a holy kiss, that's wonderful. But if you can't do that, it's either this way or no way, which makes no sense. It's like, I'd rather die than change. Well, you're gonna die.
Yeah, I just actually heard a preacher say a couple of months ago that I need to hear the amens. I need to hear the hallelujahs. Well, okay, that gets into
ego.
You're talking about your ego, and it's a very hard thing to put aside and look at your mandate is to grow.
Yeah.
and to bring in and to teach and as well as preach.
Yeah.
But we seem to be running away from that much, and that's hurting us.
Yeah.
That's hurting. One of the things that that we're finding out now, and I want to get back to once again to congregational power, is that when preachers disempower their congregations, when they are no longer able to carry on, we have chaos, and there is such a vacuum that the people are unprepared to take that next step. And that's also hurts, because what happens is that when it's not done properly, that church, that congregation will begin to lose members. People will leave because they feel that they're not valued.
Yeah.
And that's a problem. How do we combat that?
Well, again, that goes with empowering people. I think that the church is not like a movie that you go see. It's a more like a concert, if you want to use that analogy, where people are very involved and very engaged. But a lot of times, and we segment who we allow to be engaged. And the other thing is that we often we only appreciate certain gifts. So if you can sing, fine. If you can teach, fine. If you can preach, but there's so many other parts of what makes up a congregation. And I say often, we often lose people because they don't feel valued. They feel like, well, what I'm doing is not important, because nobody makes it important. And so we have to find ways to let everybody in the congregation know that their contribution means something. And we have to also, if we're really good stewards of what God has given us as leaders, we have to always be looking for other people who have leadership qualities, who can, on our Bible study, the church that I'm working with has a Bible study. And so I teach often, but once I made a suggestion, I said, well, I tell you what, let's everybody take a turn teaching. And we did that. And all of it wasn't good, but in doing that, I was able to identify people whose voice had never been heard and be able to say to them, you're a good teacher. You need to go ahead and that way, and these people probably have always been good teachers, but nobody's ever told them that. And so we often never tell people that they're gifted. We never let people know, but when Paul talks about the spiritual gifts, he doesn't talk about just the pastor, and everybody wants everybody. If you can't be top dog, you're nothing. But the truth is, I was teaching Sunday school once, and I said, my pastor was in the class, and I was saying the janitor is as important as the pastor. I say, because nobody's gonna come to a church where the toilets are not clean, and the pastor not thrilled with that statement. But it's true. The janitor is important in the body of Christ, and that janitor. In fact, one of the churches that I am very familiar with, the assistant pastor started out as a janitor. And the pastor saw gifts in him and nurtured him. And he was an excellent preacher when I heard him. I didn't know him when he was a janitor, but that showed you that God has people that we overlook certain people. And if you don't look a certain way, if you're not, you don't come from a certain family, and many in Pentecostal churches are very family. So if you're not part of the family, you sometimes get excluded. And so there are people sitting in our pews that God really wants to use that could build up our churches, but we often over them. And so we gotta find ways to involve the whole congregation in the life of the church, and not just showing up on Sunday. And it's not, it's like, it's almost like a brownie system. If you show up, you get a brownie point. So we would, the service doesn't have to be engaging, the preaching doesn't have to be good. Your job is to show up. And if you show up, you're faithful and God counts that. So this is a hot mess, but your job is to show up. But really, we looked around the congregation, there are people in our congregation that could contribute to the quality of the worship, but we never see them. All they need to do is show up. That's unfortunate. But
Yeah, that's
a lot of congregations.
not realizing that those people are part of the strength of the church.
Right. And not only are they part of the strength of the church, but their faith will be strengthened by being involved in the work of Christ. You know, if all you do is sit on the pew, you know, that's not a challenge to your faith. But when you're asked to step up, then you start examining yourself more closely, and you want to walk closer to Christ because you want to be a leader. And I don't mean pastor, but you see, you know, you want to contribute something of quality. And often the reason why people stay on milk is because we spoon feed them. You know, when a baby gets to be a certain age and we start feeding them, but if you never stop spoon feeding them, why would they go to another diet?
Right. And why would they grow?
Yeah, why would they grow? There's no need. It's easy to sit back and let you spoon feed me.
One of the things that's come up is in our conversation, well, in our questioning, is about church bylaws and church governance. And you know, I've had personally had the experience where a faction in a particular church actually jumped on the pew and bodily threw off a new preacher. That actually happened. And
I've seen things.
and we're having that at one of our churches here in Metro Atlanta, where there is a certain group who is attempting to assert themselves and take over a congregation. What does that say about the churches that we have, and what does that say about those forces within the congregation that are really going against God's mandate?
Yeah,
for how our churches should operate.
Well, first of all, that's not a great witness to the love of God. But often, why we have 200 Pentecostal denominations is because mostly from church splits. So when there's a faction church that doesn't like them, they leave and start another church, start another denomination. But if we go back to what Paul said, he said, why are there fights among you? Because everybody wants their own way. And we have to really, in those moments, because, you know, I mean, a lot of denominations are going through a lot of struggle right now. But we have to, in those moments, ask ourselves, who are we trying to emulate? What are we trying? What message, first of all, do we want to send to the world? Because if we are the church and we're fighting each other, what does that say to people who are not in the church? We're no better than they are. We handle our disagreements the same way they handle their disagreements. And so right now, I will tell you, in the Church of God, we are going through a major, we're going through a major discussion. Women in the Church of God, I'm an ordained minister. I do not vote at all. And so we're having this conversation, we've been having it for 50 years, about whether or not women will be able to vote. And that means that whenever we elect leaders, only men can vote. And so at the last assembly, the issue came to the floor and there were arguments for and against. And some of the things that were said were ugly. I mean, very ugly. But the leadership let them be said. So one of the ways that we handle disagreement is that leaders have to have the courage to say what needs to be said. And then if there's a faction that goes against leadership, and I don't know what the issue is, because it could be any issue. It could be the color of the carpet. It doesn't matter. But there's got to be a way to settle disagreements in a church. Sometimes we have to the Methodist Church right now is about to split over the issue of the LGBTQ question.
Mhm.
It has split, but it has been an ugly split. And my question is, why, as Christians, can't we disagree and still love each other? Why can't we disagree and have conversations about issues? What is it that? And again, you used the word ego. Often, what we're not protecting the Bible, or we're not protecting the Christian faith. We're protecting our ego, our way of life, our property. And so we have to step back and ask ourselves. And then the question comes up. You talked about congregational leadership, but often that's why within the Pentecostal church, congregations aren't given freedom because they don't want that kind of dissension. So everybody takes orders from the top down. But as Christians, as mature Christians, my question is, when do we learn to talk to each other about issues that we disagree about? And we haven't come to that place yet. And so the world looks at us and says, they're no better than we are. And that's where, I mean, and often, and the other thing we do, which we put our information on the street. Everybody knows about it. Not only is there a fight in the church, but the whole city knows about it.
Mhm.
And so that makes the church look even worse. So we have to find ways to I mean, Paul was not always in good standing with the churches that he ministered to, and he often had rebuked them, and often there were dissension. I mean, the Corinthian church was a hot mess, and so,
Right.
but he addressed it, and often I find that leaders will not address in a godly way, and the other issue, getting in the pulpit and calling people names is not godly, and often that's what pastors do. Instead of disarming, they arm, they make the fight more, and they choose sides. And really, a good pastor stands in the middle and says, let's come now, let's reason together. And often that's not what happens.
Yeah, and and I think that what you're saying, in spite of the fact that a church may have bylaws in place and a hierarchy, if you for want of a better word, that when we inject these bad things that you're saying, then we have chaos. Then we have chaos because
bylaws are good, but bylaws have to be revisited regularly and
yes,
changed. But we can't ever ram change down somebody else's throat. This is where, and that's where Christian patience comes in. Let's talk this through until we get to a place that we can agree on something, rather than my way, your way, or highway. There's got to be a middle ground, and often we can't find that middle ground because we are so invested. As I think it was James said, where do these disputes come from? Because we all want our own way. We're all selfish, and so our churches fracture.
James also talks about the unbridled tongue. My favorite, and you don't hear about that in churches. They don't want to get into James.
I know.
And probably one of the most ignored books in the Bible. But we have a question here about when a church does not have a leader, and we're going back to succession planning, and that's where we have this chaos. And I think it's almost a failure of leadership when we don't have a succession plan. And I've tried to talk about this in my church, and I was basically looked upon as, you don't know what you're talking about.
Or you're trying to take it over.
Right. Well, but Jesus gives us examples. Jesus had a succession plan. He taught, he trained, and then he said, okay, now go out and let me see what you can do. And then they came back, and after they sent them out 2 by 2, they came back and they had a discussion. Okay, what was your experience? What was your experience? Put that together. Okay, now what can we learn from this? What were your problems? This is how you train.
And
Yes.
it's important to have a succession plan because if you don't, and leadership changes, if you don't, and the leadership changes to somebody totally different, the church is schizophrenic because we used to do it this way and we believe this. Now we got a new leader. And so the pastor who is there at the moment needs to be training people and pouring into them in a way that there's continuity in the church. So not saying that it's going to be in stone, but there needs to be some sense that we didn't throw away a whole set of beliefs because we changed pastors. And that often when you don't, and if you change pastors often enough, it just flip flops. One week we're this way, the next week we're that. You got to find a way to. That's where the training of young people, the mentoring. Most of my life has been spent pouring into young people, and many of them have gone to do greater things than I've done. But you got to find people that use that, and you have to even pray and ask God, if you don't see anybody, then God, send me somebody. And I've done that before. Send me somebody. I'm right now, I don't know if you, what I don't have on my bio is one of the things that I tried to do that did not come to fruition was to start a college. And I wanted to start a college to train Pentecostal leaders. And it didn't come to fruition. William Seymour College. And I believe that it will come to fruition. But what I had to do as I'm getting older, I had to say, God, send somebody to finish this dream. And I had to pray and ask God, and this person came into my life. If I told you it was a miracle, but this person has proven himself, and it's a man, proven himself in so many ways. And I know this is who God sent. And I know that in my lifetime, the college will not probably come to fruition, not in its fullness, but this is the person. And so he's shown, and you have to, if to have a succession plan, you got to be patient. You got to take the time to observe people. And you have to be able to correct people when they're wrong. Too often we're so happy to get somebody, we'll take whatever garbage they put out in front of us without really trying to shape a godly influence. And that does not work. And so often these churches, when these pastors, like these bishops, they leave their sons in charge. Their sons are messed up and they've never corrected them. They've been the PK, so they've always had privileges and they've always thought they could do whatever they wanted. And that's how they run the church. We've got to take the time to find God, to ask God to put in our path godly people that we can pour into, that we can leave in charge of his church. See, that the problem is that often the reason why we don't have a succession plan is we think it's our church and it's God's church. And so because we don't realize it's God's church, we figure we'll live forever. And if we don't and it dies, so what? But the truth is it's God's church, and God has always has a ram in the bush. But we often don't take the time to look for that ram.
Wow. That's deep. I usually ask for, as we get to the tail end of our program here, I usually ask for some closing remarks, as I will ask this time. And I want to remind our listeners that we will see Dr. Alexander again, because we're going to get a little bit more deeper into her on our next broadcast. And as awesome as this lesson has been, I'm sure we're in for another fantastic treat. But again, Doctor, if you would like to close out with the remark, it's your platform right now.
Well, I'm not sure what remark I would make, except that, this has been an interesting journey. And being a Christian is an interesting journey. And being a Christian leader is an interesting journey. And God, we are living in a time that's calling for people who call themselves Christians and who are called by Christ to really step up to the plate because we're going to go in these next few years, especially with all the political upheaval and with the economic upheaval that our people are going through. We, especially in the Black church, we need leaders, first of all, who are committed to Christ and committed to the welfare of his church and to the welfare of his people, who will do whatever they can in their strength and with the help of God to really help our people deal with issues. People are scared. People are scared. People are depressed, even Christians. And we've got to make the church a safe place. And we have to be almost like the Underground Railroad. We have to be a place where people can go and feel secure and feel that they're really loved for who they are. And that's what God has called us to do. He's called us as leaders, not to, people, talk about everything I've done. I haven't done anything. I never tried to be somebody. I tried to do what God would have me do. And I think that we have to have leaders who are willing to do what God would have them do on behalf of God's church and for God's people. And if we can raise those kind of leaders today, the church will be a better place.
Wow. Those closing remarks almost sounded like a prayer to me. From your lips to God's ear. Certainly hope. Let me pray. Thank you so much, Doctor. Thank you so much, Dr. Alexander. We shall be doing this again soon. We want all our WCEG listeners and viewers to be mindful of the notifications that will come out on our social media and whatever else way we can get it out, because we will have another session with the inimitable Dr. Alexander. Boy, we appreciate your contribution today. Thank you so much, Dr. Estrelda Y. Alexander. We appreciate you so much. I appreciate you so much. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
And thank you all for listening and viewing, and we'll see you again soon.